Okay. Hello, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the UBC Camp's Play and Learn at Home live stream. My name is Kate, and today we're going to be learning about the importance of pollinators in healthy ecosystems. And then we're going to be making a mason bee house together, and this is just a little bit of a sneak peek preview about what that's going to look like when we're done. So before we get started, I just want to share a few housekeeping notes. For our live stream today, all participant video and audio should be turned off. So if one of you or your caregivers have a question, you can use the chat function and one of our moderators will respond as soon as possible. Please just ensure that you're using respectful and camp-appropriate language at all times when you're using the chat. Okay, let's dive right in. So most of the things that you're going to need for today's activity can be found in a recycling bin, which I think is super cool. You're going to need some scissors. You're going to need a pen or a pencil, preferably one that's round like this one. You're going to need some parchment paper like this that you can find in your kitchen. But if you don't have parchment paper, you can also use construction paper or the kind of brown paper that you find in paper grocery bags. You're also going to need a can like this one with the lid cut off, or a milk carton like this one with the top cut off as well. You're also going to need some tape. If you want to add a little bit of structure to your tin mason bee house, you can also grab a couple toilet paper rolls. And then if you want to decorate your mason bee house afterward, you can also grab some paint. When you hang up your mason bee house, you'll also need some string, but you won't need it for this part of the activity. So before we jump in, I want to start us off by introducing us to a couple vocabulary terms so we can better understand the big picture when we're talking about bees. The first term is biodiversity. Biodiversity. This is a word that can be broken down into two parts, bio and diversity. Bio is a suffix that refers to the Greek word for life. So a book that is a biography is about someone's life, and a wrapper that is biodegradable can be broken down by living things. Diversity means that there are many different things. So a rainbow has a diversity of colors, or many colors. And then if you put them together, biodiversity means what? You got it, it's the diversity of life. So there are many different living things in an ecosystem or in your backyard or even under a rock in your garden. This might be a word that you're already familiar with, but an ecosystem is a community of living things and non-living things that interact as part of one big system. Things like dirt and sunlight. Ecosystem services are the processes by which the environment produces essential resources like clean water and air that we often take for granted. Going back to my last example, what is an ecosystem service that a forest might provide? One thing that comes to mind for me is that trees produce oxygen, which we need to breathe. And the reason I talk about this is because another one of the ecosystem services that we rely on the most as human beings is pollination. So I've got my flowers over here, and I've got them because pollinators collect the sweet nectar from flowers. And as they fly from flower to flower, they also do another important job. They spread little fluffy pieces called pollen. When pollen from one flower gets into another flower, they can make more seeds to grow new plants. Pollinators are really important for plants to be able to make new baby plants, which means they're super useful for keeping our gardens and our ecosystems healthy and growing. At the UBC farm, we try to increase habitats, which are the specific places where organisms make their homes, for our pollinators by maintaining forested areas, planting flowering shrubs and plants in our hedgerows, and even making some mason bee homes. I have a slide if Kira is able to pull it up. Yeah, so see if you can spot where the mason bee houses are in these photos. Some of our pollinators live in these mason bee houses and in the built environments that we create, but other ones are wild and make their homes in our hedgerows and in our gardens and in our forests. We also have honeybee hives at the UBC farm. These hives are actually used for honeybee research, where UBC scientists look at what makes a healthy honeybee hive. One of the ways the bees stay healthy is actually by practicing hygienic behavior, just like we're all doing by washing our hands all the time during COVID. This means that they clean their rooms and themselves by removing diseased and decaying material from their hive. This increases their protection from diseases and parasites, making everyone in the hive, including the babies, healthier and happier. So you've probably heard that bees and butterflies are pollinators, but do you know of any other species that might pollinate as well? So some of our more famous pollinators are on this slide, like the western honeybee and the bumblebee, which you've probably seen in your garden. But there are so many other kinds of pollinators that help produce and reproduce flowers. So on the top left corner, there are mason bees, which we're making a house for today. And they actually look quite different from the normal bees that you would see kind of like in books and in art and in movies. There are also other kinds of pollinators like hummingbirds, like hawk moths, insects like ants and hoverflies and beetles, and even bats, which are one of the few mammals that support pollination. And although honeybees are used in agriculture, they're not always the most efficient pollinators for certain crops, nor are they always as proficient in pollinating native plant species as pollinators that are native to specific ecosystems. For example, honeybees and bumblebees are superstar pollinators for squash flowers, but hoverflies are just the right size to pollinate strawberries. If you look on the bottom where the white flower is for the tiny little hoverfly, that's about how big it is. Ants like to munch on the pollen from Queen Anne's lace, and bats pollinate bananas, which makes them one of my favorite pollinators. And with over 20,000 species of bees worldwide, native bees play a critical role in ecosystems and also in the production of our food. In fact, we're very lucky to have more than 450 species of native bees in BC alone, and over 4,000 in North America. Bees are super important for our ecosystems. They pollinate over 80% of the world's plants. That means that 1 out of every 3 or 4 bites you eat is thanks to a bee. That's why it's so important that we protect bee habitats and create homes for them, like we're doing together today. All right, who's ready to get started building our mason bee house? So as a reminder, we're going to need a pen or a pencil. We're going to need some tape. We're going to need parchment paper or else construction paper or brown paper from a paper bag. And you can also grab yourself some toilet paper rolls and some string and some paint for later on. You can also use paper, but thicker paper is better because it makes sure that the mason bees can stay warm. All right, so I'm just going to tilt my screen down so that you can see what I'm doing. So the very first thing that we're going to do is we're going to take our pen or our pencil and we're going to measure the depth of our mason bee house. And this is just so we know how long our tubes are going to need to be. So you can just put your pen or your pencil into the tin can and mark how deep it goes like this. This is going to be your measure for how long all of your rolls are going to be. So once you have that, you can take your parchment paper or your construction paper or your brown paper, whatever you're using, and using the spot that you marked on your pen or your pencil, you can mark how wide your strip of paper has to be. So I think mine is around here. If it's a little bit long or a little bit short, it doesn't matter too much. You can always cut them shorter if you need, and if they're a little bit too short for the can, that's not really an issue. So don't stress too much. But once you have a general idea of how deep your container is going to be, then you can just cut a long strip like this. right, so I have my long strip of parchment paper now, but I actually don't need my paper to be this long to create just one roll of paper. So I'm actually going to cut this into 3 separate pieces so that they can become 3 separate rolls. If you're using paper with different dimensions, you can play around with it to see what fits best. But the amount that you'll need to make a roll is going to look kind of like this. So it's just a little bit smaller than my hand. And I'm going to cut this again. So now I have 3 slips of parchment paper. Okay, so I'm almost ready to roll. But what I'm going to do before I get started is I'm going to take my tape and I'm going to ration myself out a few pieces of it like this and just put them on the side of my desk so they're handy when I need them. This is really helpful because the parchment paper can be a little bit slippery and can unravel if you're not too careful. So having these on hand is going to make your process a lot easier. So then you're going to take your trusty pencil or your pen and you're going to place it at the very edge of your parchment paper. And then you're just going to roll the parchment paper over like this. And then you're just going to keep rolling until you make it to the end of the paper. Just rolling like this. Now the parchment paper is pretty slippery and the tape doesn't stick to it so well. So when you are taping up your roll, I would just recommend that you stick the tape to itself. So you're just going to put the tape on like this and you're going to wrap it around and you're going to stick it to itself. And then you can pull it off the pencil and voila, there's your first roll. So when you're rolling these, I'm going to do this one more time so that we can just do it together. When you're rolling these, you want to make sure that you can roll them at least 5 times before you tape them off. And this just makes sure that the paper walls are thick enough to keep the baby mason bees warm in the winter. So you're rolling, you take your tape, and you just wrap them around like this. Here we go, there's our second roll. And as you probably noticed in our demo mason bee house, these rolls are all different sizes. Some of them are really small and some of them are really big. So if yours aren't all the same size, it's totally fine. It just means that the mason bees will take up more room in the bigger ones. So I'm going to do this again. I'm going to fold the wax paper over. I'm just going to roll like this. It depends a little bit on how big you make your rolls. But you're going to want to keep going until you have as many as you need to completely fill up your container. You're probably not going to have enough time to make all of your mason bee tubes during this webinar, so don't stress out too much if you can't get them all done. You can just keep working away until you have as many as you need. So while we keep rolling the tubes to fill our mason bee houses, let's talk for a little bit about why mason bee houses look like this. To understand why we're making these tubes, we need to know about the mason bee life cycle. So I'll bet you've noticed that the house we're making doesn't really look like a beehive, and that's because it's actually not a beehive. Some bees, like honeybees and bumblebees, live in hives where they all work together to make food and make more baby bees. These bees make their own homes out of the wax that they make from honey. But there are also many species of bees that are solitary bees. Mason bees are one of these, so instead of working with other bees to make hives, mason bees find hiding places to lay their eggs. Normally, mason bees would look for holes in trees or cracks in rocks or any spot they can squeeze into, but sometimes it can be hard for mason bees to find holes that are deep enough or protected enough. So our mason bee houses provide the perfect cozy place for our bees to store nectar and eggs. So let's go back in time a little bit to the fall and the winter. This is when mason bees make their cocoons where they stay throughout all of the cold months. This is their form of hibernation, just like bears hibernate. In the spring, adult mason bees emerge from the cocoons and start their life cycle again. Once they've found a good hole, they gather nectar and they bring it back to the hole for storage, pollinating all kinds of plants as they go. Then they lay their eggs beside their pollen brick and seal it up with a wall made out of mud, making a little room for the baby mason bee. They repeat this process over and over, gathering pollen, laying an egg, and making the mud wall until the holes or tubes are all filled up. The female mason bee spends all summer doing this, and then she dies. The baby mason bee hatches into a larva around July and starts eating the pollen that its parents left for it. At this point, the bee is a larva still, so it has no eyes or legs to go out and find food. So it's a really good thing that the mom left all of that pollen for them to eat. So the bee eats and grows all summer long, and by the time they're an adult, it's fall again. Do you think it makes sense for the bee to leave its home during the fall and the winter? It would have a really hard time finding anything to eat, since there aren't many flowers. So instead, around September is when the mason bee starts to hibernate in its cocoon, waiting for the next spring flowers to bloom so it can emerge and start the cycle again. This is actually right around now, and I'm sure that you've been noticing all of the flowers blooming in your neighborhood. If you have a garden, you may have noticed some of these bees buzzing around and starting to do their pollination. So now that we know the mason bee life cycle, can you imagine this happening in your very own mason bee house? Super exciting. Mason bees hardly ever sting, but some people are allergic to bee stings. So it's really good to check in with an adult before you set up your bee house if anyone in your family or in your area has a bee allergy. So how are we doing with those tubes? How many have you managed to make so far? It can take a little bit of time to figure out. So even if you've done just one or two, that's amazing. And then you're just going to keep going until you have enough to completely fill up your mason bee house. So even though I know that folks are still working on making out their tubes, I'm going to start showing you how to put your mason bee house together so that when you're done, you'll know how to assemble your bee house and make it fully intact. So I'm using a tin can for my mason bee house, which is why I have these two toilet paper rolls. I'm just going to put these two guys in here, kind of like I'm creating floors in a condo. And this is just going to help me make sure that all of my tubes don't rattle around too much when I'm putting them in. So before this webinar started, I actually got a jump on this activity, and I made myself a whole big pile of mason bee tubes that kind of look like this. Just spaces in the can. If I notice that any of them are a little bit too long and are kind of sticking out, I might just kind of trim them as I go. So I'm noticing that this one is a little bit long. I'm just going to take my scissors and snip it down to the right size like this. Just going to keep going like this. We call these guys mason bee houses, but the truth is that they're actually more like mason bee apartments, because since the bees are solitary, they're each going to be living in their own individual tube. So when we're making these, we're actually making homes not just for one mason bee, but for a whole bunch of different mason bee families, which I think is pretty cool. And when you're slotting these in, a couple of good reminders are just to make sure that you're getting them in snugly enough that they're not going to fall out or shake out if you move this around too much. But you also want to make sure that you're not crushing the tubes against each other. So you want them to retain most of their shape, because if you crush them too much, then there isn't going to be room for the mason bees to live inside them. How are those tubes coming? I think that I might not actually have enough tubes yet, so I'm probably going to have to do the same thing as you and keep on making some extra ones until all of this is filled in. If for whatever reason your tubes really aren't sticking very well inside your mason bee house, you can also put a little bit of liquid glue at the bottom, and that will help just secure some of the tubes in there. But you don't have to do that. All right, so I'm just about done. And as you can see, I've filled it in most of the way, but I'm still not totally done. I've still got a few more to go. But when I am done, I'm going to take some paint and I'm going to decorate mine so that it's really visible and so that I can see it when it's hanging in my garden. And I'm going to use a string if I need to, or I'm going to find a place in my garden where I can just let this guy rest sideways like this. When your mason bee house is complete, you can hang it about 3 feet above ground anywhere in your garden. Then all you have to do is wait and watch for your bees to move in. You'll know they've moved in when the paper tubes are filled up with mud. And it's super important that you don't touch the mason bee house or move it around too much, because if the bees settle in for the summer, you'll want to make sure that they're able to keep coming back to that place and have it be undisturbed. So if your bees do settle in this summer, by the next, your garden will be buzzing with tons of little critters, which I think is super exciting. All right, that's it for today, everyone. Thank you so much for joining, and good luck as you continue to make your mason bee houses. We super want to hear how they go, and if you start to notice more bee activity in your neighborhood or your garden. Join UBC camps again on Monday, June 1st from 11 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. for kids aged 6 to 8 for dance play kids, which is a high energy kids physical activity program that plays with dance and promotes mental health through the 3 rules of play: be positive, be fun, and be yourself. This session has also been recorded and will be posted on UBC Camp's YouTube channel. Please share your experience online by tagging at UBC Camps on Instagram and UBC Camps on Facebook, and you can use the hashtag UBCPlayLearn. We really want to know how your mason bee houses turn out, and we want to see them in your garden. So please, please let us know. And if you want to check out the UBC Farm, we are on Instagram at UBC Farm and at UBC Farm on Facebook. You can sign up for our newsletter for programming and market announcements for the season. Thank you again for joining us. So bye everyone, and have a good day, and enjoy the sun.